Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore what Roman prostitutes actually did all day in ancient Rome. This is going to be an extremely detailed, methodical examination of the daily routines, work conditions, and lives of sex workers in the Roman Empire that will hopefully help you drift off to sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a long, thorough, and decidedly boring journey through this aspect of Roman social history. Boring history for sleep. What did Roman prostitutes actually do all day? Chapter 1. Understanding prostitution in Roman society. To understand what Roman prostitutes actually did all day, we must first establish the social, legal, and economic context in which prostitution existed in ancient Rome. Prostitution was legal and common throughout the Roman Empire, from the early Republic through the imperial period, and it occupied a complex position in Roman society that was quite different from how prostitution is viewed in many modern societies. Roman attitudes toward sexuality were generally more permissive than those of many later Western societies, though they were still governed by strict social rules related to status, gender, and power. Sexual activity was not considered sinful or immoral in itself, as it would be in later Christian periods, but rather was evaluated based on whether it conformed to appropriate social roles and hierarchies. Men of the citizen class were expected to be sexually active and dominant, while women were expected to be chaste and submissive, with different rules applying to different classes of women. Prostitution was seen as a necessary and inevitable part of urban life. Roman moralists and philosophers might criticize excessive indulgence in prostitution or warn about the financial dangers of becoming too attached to expensive prostitutes, but they generally did not condemn the existence of prostitution itself. This institution was viewed as serving a social function by providing sexual outlets for men, particularly for young men who were not yet married and for men whose wives were unavailable or unsuitable for certain sexual activities that Romans considered degrading for respectable women. The legal status of prostitutes in Roman law was complex and reflected their marginal social position. Prostitutes were classified as infames, meaning people of low legal and social status who faced various legal disabilities. They could not marry into respectable families, could not inherit property through normal channels, could not testify in court under most circumstances, and were generally excluded from the protections and privileges that Roman citizens enjoyed. This legal marginalization reflected the view that prostitutes had surrendered their sexual honor and thus their claim to respectability. However, prostitution itself was not illegal. Prostitutes were required to register with the aediles, who were Roman magistrates, responsible for various aspects of urban administration including regulation of markets and public order. Upon registration, a prostitute would receive a license and would be required to pay taxes upon their earnings. The registration system served multiple purposes including generating tax revenue, allowing authorities to monitor and control prostitution, and officially marking individuals as prostitutes, which would affect their legal and social status permanently. The decision to become a prostitute was rarely a free choice in the modern sense. Some prostitutes were slaves who had been purchased specifically for sex work or who had been assigned to prostitution by their owners. These enslaved sex workers had no choice in the matter and received no payment for their work, with all earnings going to their owners. Other prostitutes were free but impoverished women who entered prostitution because they had no other means of supporting themselves. Still others were freed women, former slaves, who had been manumitted but who continued in sex work because they lacked other skills or opportunities. The economic circumstances that drove women into prostitution were varied but generally involved poverty and lack of alternatives. Women in the Roman world had limited opportunities for employment. Respectable occupations for women included spinning and weaving, working as servants or nurses, selling goods in markets, or working in family businesses. These occupations typically paid very little, and might not provide enough income for a woman to support herself independently. Prostitution, while socially degrading, could potentially provide more income than these alternatives, though as we shall see, most prostitutes remained poor. The hierarchy within prostitution was significant and affected the daily lives and experiences of sex workers. At the top of the hierarchy were high-class courtesans, called meretrices, who served wealthy clients and who might live in relative comfort. These women might have some education, musical or artistic skills, and social graces that made them suitable companions for elite men at dinner parties and other social occasions, as well as for sexual services. Below them were common prostitutes who worked in brothels or on the streets, serving less wealthy clients and living in much harsher conditions. At the bottom were the most degraded sex workers, including those who worked in the cheapest establishments or who sold themselves on the streets for minimal fees. The locations where prostitution occurred were varied and included dedicated brothels, taverns and inns, baths, private homes, and public spaces. The type of location affected the daily routine, the joint working conditions, and the types of clients that sex workers encountered. A prostitute working in an upscale brothel near the Forum would have a very different daily experience than one working in a grimy establishment in a poor neighborhood or one soliciting clients on the street. The clients of Roman prostitutes came from all social classes, though the types of prostitutes they patronized varied with their wealth and status. Poor men might visit cheap prostitutes in low-class brothels, or might hire street workers for quick encounters in alleys or doorways. Middling citizens might frequent better established brothels or taverns where prostitutes worked. Wealthy men might keep slaves for sexual purposes in their own homes, might maintain relationships with expensive courtesans, or might visit high-class establishments. Soldiers, sailors, travelers, and migrants were particularly important clientele for prostitutes in port cities and garrison towns. Understanding this context is essential before we can examine the actual daily activities and routines of Roman prostitutes. Their days were shaped by their legal status, their economic circumstances, their place in the hierarchy of sex work, the locations where they worked, and the needs and demands of their clients. The lives of Roman prostitutes were characterized by hardship, exploitation, social stigma, and lack of autonomy, though experiences varied considerably depending on individual circumstances. Chapter 2. The Morning Routine. Let us now examine in detail what a typical day might look like for a Roman prostitute. Beginning with the morning hours, we must acknowledge that there was no single typical experience, as daily routines varied depending on whether the prostitute was enslaved or free, where she worked, and what type of clients she served. However, we can construct plausible descriptions based on historical evidence from literary sources, legal texts, graffiti, and archaeological remains of brothels. For a prostitute who worked in a brothel, which was called a lupanar in Latin, the day would begin relatively late. Brothels typically conducted most of their business in the afternoon and evening, when men had finished their daily activities and had leisure time to seek entertainment. Therefore, prostitutes who worked in brothels would not need to rise early and might sleep until mid-morning or even later if they had worked late into the previous night. The sleeping arrangements in brothels were typically quite basic. Lower-class brothels would have small cells or rooms where prostitutes both worked and slept. These rooms were tiny, often no more than 6 to 8 feet square, just large enough for a small bed or mattress and perhaps a chair or stool. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii, where several brothels have been preserved by volcanic ash, shows that these cells had stone beds with thin mattresses and had very limited ventilation and light, with small high windows or no windows at all. A prostitute sleeping in such a cell would wake in dimness and stuffiness. The air would smell of bodies, of sex, of the oil lamps that provided light at night, and of whatever cleaning or perfuming substances were used in the establishment. The prostitute would rise from her bed, which might be the same bed where she had serviced clients the previous evening, and would begin her morning preparations. Personal hygiene in ancient Rome was important but challenging, particularly for poor people. A brothel prostitute would not have easy access to the public baths that were central to Roman hygiene practices, as prostitutes were often excluded or segregated in baths due to their low status. Instead, she might wash using a basin of water, wiping her body with cloths, and perhaps using olive oil to clean her skin, as was common in Roman hygiene. The water would be cold unless the establishment had heating, which most lower-class brothels would not. The prostitute would attend to her appearance, which was important for attracting clients. She would comb her hair, possibly using oil to make it shine, and to control it, she might apply cosmetics, including white lead makeup, to lighten her face, red ochre or other pigments to color her cheeks and lighten lips, and darkening substances to accentuate her eyes. These cosmetics were similar to those used by respectable women, but might be applied more heavily to create a more dramatic appearance that would attract attention. The clothing worn by prostitutes was distinctive and was regulated by law in some periods. Prostitutes were required to wear togas, which were traditionally male garments, rather than the stola worn by respectable married women. This requirement marked prostitutes as outside respectable femininity and as sexually available. The toga worn by a prostitute would typically be darker in color than the white togas worn by male citizens, often being brown, dark red, or another dark shade. The clothing would be made of relatively cheap fabric and would be worn directly against the skin without the undergarments that respectable women wore. After washing and dressing, the prostitute would need to eat something if food was available. The diet of brothel prostitutes would be basic and probably not very nutritious. They might eat bread, which was the staple food of the Roman poor, perhaps with some olive oil, or a bit of cheese if available. They might drink water or cheap wine. The food would be provided by the brothel owner or pimp who controlled the establishment, and would be of minimal quality and quantity, just enough to keep the workers functional. For prostitutes who were enslaved, the morning routine would be even more constrained and unpleasant. Enslaved sex workers had no control over their time or activities and would be at the complete mercy of their owners. They would be woken when their owner or overseer decided they should be woken, would be given minimal time and resources for hygiene and grooming, and would be fed whatever the owner chose to provide. An enslaved prostitute might be punished physically if she did not prepare herself adequately or quickly enough to begin work. For higher status prostitutes, the morning routine would be somewhat different and would afford more comfort and autonomy. A successful courtesan who maintained her own residence rather than working in a brothel would wake in her own bed in her own apartment or small house. She would have more privacy, more space, and more control over her environment. She might have a servant or enslaved person to assist her with washing, dressing, and preparing her hair and makeup. She would eat better food and would have more time to prepare for the day. The morning would be a time for such a woman to attend to personal business, to rest, and to prepare for receiving clients later in the day. She might send messages to regular clients, might shop for food or clothing if she could afford to do so, or might simply relax. However, even for higher status prostitutes, the morning routine would be oriented toward preparing for work, as their income depended on being attractive and available to clients. After completing morning preparations, brothel prostitutes would wait for the establishment to open for business. The brothel owner or manager would determine when to open, but this would typically be around midday or early afternoon. Before opening, there might be some cleaning or preparation of the establishment, though brothels were generally not maintained in clean conditions and would have been grimy and unpleasant. The prostitutes might be expected to help with this work or might simply wait in their cells until clients began to arrive. The morning hours, while providing some respite from the demands of clients, were not truly free time for most prostitutes. They were preparing for work, were confined to their places of employment, and were subject to the control of brothel owners or pimps who determined the conditions of their lives. The morning routine was characterized by basic survival activities, by attempts to make oneself presentable for work, and by waiting for the afternoon and evening hours when business would commence. Chapter 3. The afternoon receiving clients. As the day progressed into afternoon, prostitutes would begin receiving clients. This was the core activity of their day and the peak source of whatever income they earned, or that was earned from their bodies if they were enslaved. Let us examine in detail what this work entailed and what a prostitute would actually do during these hours of client interaction. The process of acquiring clients varied depending on where the prostitute worked. In a brothel, clients would enter the establishment and would be presented with the available prostitutes. In the best documented brothel from Pompeii, which had about 10 small cells, prostitutes would stand or sit near their cells while clients walked through examining the options. The prostitute's cell door might be open to display the interior, and there might be a sign or painted image indicating the prostitute's name, specialty, or price. Clients would select a prostitute based on appearance, reputation, specialty, and price. Prices varied enormously depending on the status of the prostitute and the nature of the services provided. The cheapest sexual encounters might cost as little as 1 or 2 asses, which were small bronze coins of minimal value equivalent to perhaps the cost of a loaf of bread. More expensive services in better establishments might cost several sesterces or even more. High-class courtesans might charge many times these amounts for an evening of companionship and sex. Once a client had selected a prostitute and agreed on a price, the transaction would occur quite quickly in lower-class establishments. The client would pay the brothel owner or an attendant who managed payments, and the prostitute and client would enter the cell where the prostitute worked. In more expensive establishments, there might be more preliminary conversation, perhaps the offer of wine or food, and generally a less rushed interaction. The physical environment where sex work occurred in lower-class brothels was plain, cramped, dark, and unpleasant. The small cell would contain a bed or sleeping platform and little else. There would be minimal privacy, as the walls were thin and sounds from adjacent cells would be clearly audible. There might be crude erotic paintings on the walls which served to posh and advertise the services available and to create an atmosphere conducive to sexual activity. The cell would smell of bodies, of sex, of oil lamps, and of whatever other odors accumulated in a small, poorly ventilated space. The sexual services provided varied but were generally quite basic in lower-class establishments. The client would have paid for a specific service, and that is what would be provided, typically as quickly as possible to allow the prostitute to move on to the next client. The most common service was straightforward vaginal intercourse, which the Romans called the natural position, typically with the prostitute lying on her back and the client on top. This was the cheapest and most standard service. Other services that might be requested and that would cost more included oral sex, which was considered particularly degrading in Roman culture, and which commanded higher prices. Romans viewed oral sex as humiliating for the person performing it because it placed them in a submissive position and involved contact with parts of the body considered impure. Anal sex was another option that some prostitutes offered and that some clients preferred. Romans were relatively accepting of anal sex compared to some later cultures, though it still carried associations with degradation and domination. The duration of each client encounter in a cheap brothel would be brief, perhaps 10 to 15 minutes or even less. The prostitute's goal would be to satisfy the client quickly and efficiently to maximize the number of clients she could service in a given time period. There would be minimal conversation, minimal foreplay, and minimal attempt to create any kind of emotional or romantic atmosphere. It was a commercial transaction focused on the client's orgasm and nothing more. The physical demands of sex work were significant. A prostitute might service 10, 15, or even 20 clients in a busy afternoon and evening. This would involve repeated sexual activity with men who are often unwashed, rough, and inconsiderate of the prostitute's comfort or well-being. The prostitute would experience physical soreness, irritation, and exhaustion from this repeated activity. There was no concept of client screening for health or hygiene, and prostitutes were regularly exposed to sexually transmitted infections and other diseases. The risk of pregnancy was constant and serious. While Romans had some methods of contraception including pessaries, made from wool soaked in various substances, herbal preparations, drunk-as teas, and other folk remedies, these methods were not very effective. Prostitutes would frequently become pregnant, and pregnancy was a serious problem as it would prevent them from working and earning. Various methods of abortion were practiced, including drinking herbal concoctions, physical trauma to the abdomen, and insertion of objects into the uterus. These methods were dangerous and often ineffective, and many prostitutes suffered from complications or death resulting from attempted abortions. Violence from clients was another constant risk. While brothels might have an owner or enforcer present to prevent the worst violence, prostitutes were regularly hit, choked, or otherwise abused by clients. The low social status of prostitutes meant they had little recourse if they were injured or abused. Reporting violence to authorities would be pointless, as prostitutes had minimal legal standing, and authorities would not take action over violence against a prostitute unless it was so extreme that it threatened public order. Between clients, prostitutes would have brief moments to recover. They might clean themselves using cloths and water, though facilities for this would be minimal. They might rest for a few moments before the next client arrived. They might talk with other prostitutes in nearby cells if there was a lull in business. However, these intervals would be brief, as the brothel owner would want to maximize the number of clients serviced and thus the revenue generated. The afternoon would blend into evening as business continued. The flow of clients would vary by day, with some days being busier than others. Days when many men received pay, festival days, market days, and days when large numbers of people were in the city, for various reasons, would be busier. Other days might be slower, with fewer clients and less income generated. The prostitute would have no control over how busy business was and would simply have to work as clients arrived. For higher-class prostitutes, the afternoon and evening would be different in character, though still focused on serving clients. A courtesan might receive a single wealthy client for an extended visit that would include conversation, dinner, entertainment, and sex. The interaction would be less rushed, more social, and would involve more attention to creating a pleasant atmosphere. However, even for these higher-status sex workers, the core activity was still providing sexual services in exchange for payment, and the work still involved physical demands and emotional labor. By evening, as the sun set and oil lamps were lit, prostitutes in brothels would have been working for hours and would have serviced numerous clients. They would be physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and would face the prospect of continuing work into the night as long as clients continued to arrive. The afternoon and early evening represented the peak hours of sex work, and they were characterized by repetitive sexual labor, physical discomfort, constant risk, and little respite or relief. Chapter 4. Evening and Night Activities. As afternoon transitioned into evening and then into night, the activities of Roman prostitutes would continue, though the character of the work might shift somewhat. Let us examine what prostitutes did during these later hours, and how their evening and night routines unfolded. In brothels, evening was often the busiest time. After the day's work was finished, after dinner was eaten, men would have leisure time to seek entertainment and pleasure. The brothels would be crowded with clients, and prostitutes would continue the same pattern of client service that they had been providing during the afternoon, but with potentially even greater volume of business. The atmosphere in brothels in the evening would be rowdy and unpleasant. Men who had been drinking, who were in groups with friends, who were emboldened by the cover of darkness, would be loud, crude, and demanding. The noise level would be high, with laughter, conversation, arguments, and the sounds of sexual activity all blending together. The smell would be worse as bodies accumulated, odors, and as oil lamps burned and smoked, filling the poorly ventilated spaces with fumes. Prostitutes would work through the evening with little or no break. The physical exhaustion would accumulate, making each additional client more difficult to endure. The repetitive nature of the sexual activity, the lack of genuine arousal or pleasure for the prostitute, the soreness and discomfort, the need to feign enthusiasm or at least compliance, all of these would take a psychological as well as physical toll. Some prostitutes might be able to emotionally dissociate from the activity, treating it as purely mechanical labor that their bodies performed while their minds went elsewhere, but even this coping mechanism would be exhausting to maintain hour after hour. The pricing structure might change in the evening, with some prostitutes charging slightly more for services performed at night or with drunk clients who might be willing to pay extra. However, the differences in pint flour would be small, and most prostitutes would still be earning minimal amounts that largely went to brothel owners rather than to the prostitutes themselves. Food and drink would be pint flour available in some brothels as part of the services offered to clients. Men might drink wine while waiting for their turn with a prostitute, or might share wine with the prostitute as part of the encounter. However, prostitutes would need to be careful not to drink too much, as being intoxicated would make them vulnerable to even greater abuse and would reduce their ability to manage clients and to protect themselves as much as they could. As the night wore on, perhaps around midnight or later, the flow of clients would begin to diminish. The brothel would become less crowded, and there would be longer intervals between clients. Prostitutes would have moments to rest, though they would need to remain available in case additional clients arrived. The brothel owner would determine when to close for the night, which might be very late or might be when business slowed sufficiently. The remaining open was not worthwhile. When the brothel finally closed, prostitutes would perform whatever end-of-day activities were necessary. They might wash themselves more thoroughly than the brief cleanings between clients had allowed. They might eat something if food was available, though it would be simple fare. They might talk with other prostitutes, sharing the experiences of the day, complaining about particular clients, offering support or advice. These brief social interactions with other sex workers would be one of the few sources of human connection and solidarity in otherwise isolated and difficult lives. The sleeping arrangements would be the same cramped cells where they had worked. A prostitute would lie down on the same bed where she had serviced clients throughout the day and would try to sleep despite the discomfort, the lingering smells, the sounds of other people in the establishment, and the physical aches from the day's work. Sleep might be difficult to achieve, but exhaustion would eventually overcome discomfort, and the prostitute would sleep until the next day's cycle began. For street prostitutes, the evening and night would be their primary working hours. These prostitutes solicited clients in public spaces, including streets, alleys, arcades, and areas near taverns and entertainment venues. They would stand or walk in areas known for prostitution, making their availability known through their dress, their location, and their behavior. Street prostitution was even more dangerous and degrading than brothel work. Street prostitutes were exposed to the weather, to harassment from passers-by, to violence from clients, and to predation by criminals. They had no protection from a brothel owner, no enclosed space where transactions occurred, and no screening of clients whatsoever. They would typically perform sexual services in alleyways, in doorways, in cemeteries, or in any secluded spot available, with minimal privacy and comfort. The prices charged by street prostitutes were even lower than those in cheap brothels, as they occupied the very bottom of the prostitution hierarchy. Their clients were the poorest men, those who could not afford even the minimal fees of brothels. The services provided would be the most basic, typically quick vaginal intercourse performed standing up or with minimal preparation. The entire transaction from solicitation to completion might take only a few minutes. Street prostitutes worked until very late at night, or until they had earned enough for the day, or until they were too exhausted to continue. They might face violence, might be robbed of their earnings, might be arrested by authorities if there was a campaign against street prostitution, or might simply be ignored and allowed to continue their desperate work. Their lives were characterized by extreme poverty, constant danger, and minimal hope for improvement. For higher-class prostitutes, the evening might involve entertainment work as well as sexual dinner party with a wealthy client, providing companionship, conversation, and sexual entertainment for the client, and perhaps for his guests. These events would last for hours and would require the prostitute to be charming, entertaining, and sexually available, while maintaining an appropriate demeanor and not embarrassing the client. Such an evening would require different skills than quick sexual transactions. The prostitute would need to be able to converse intelligently, to laugh at jokes, to play music or sing if she had those skills, to participate in drinking and feasting while not becoming too drunk, and to be sexually available and skilled when required. The payment for such an evening would be much higher than for simple sexual services, but the demands would also be greater. When the evening entertainment concluded, possibly very late at night or even into the early morning hours, the courtesan would return to her own residence and would prepare for bed. She might have had a physically easier evening than a brothel prostitute in terms of the number of sexual encounters, but the emotional labor of being entertaining and charming for hours, of managing a client's expectations and moods, and of maintaining the illusion of genuine interest and affection would being entertaining and charming for hours, of managing a client's expectations and moods, and of maintaining the illusion of genuine interest and affection would be exhausting in its own way. The night would end with sleep, though the quality and duration of sleep would depend on how late a prostitute had worked and what demands would be placed on her the next day. For most prostitutes, sleep would be inadequate, interrupted, and insufficient for genuine rest and recovery. They would wake the next morning to repeat the same cycle, day after day, with little variation and little hope for change. Chapter 5: Economic Realities and Financial Management. To understand what Roman prostitutes actually did all day, we must examine the economic aspects of their lives. How much money did they earn? How was that money managed? What could they afford with their earnings? These questions reveal important dimensions of the daily experience of sex work in ancient Rome. The pricing structure of Roman prostitution varied enormously depending on the status of the prostitute, the location of the work, and the nature of the services provided. As mentioned earlier, the cheapest sexual encounters might cost only 1 or 2 asses, which were small bronze coins. To put this in context, one as might purchase a cup of cheap wine or a piece of bread. A plain Roman laborer might earn perhaps 4 to 16 asses per day depending on the type of work. So, the cheapest prostitution was extremely inexpensive, accessible even to the poorest men. More typical prices in low to mid-range brothels might be 2 to 8 asses, or perhaps a half sesterces to 2 sesters. A sesterces was worth 4 asses, so these prices represented a small but not insignificant amount for working-class clients. Graffiti from Pompeii records prices including 2 asses for basic services, which was the most commonly mentioned price in paw. These informal records, higher-class prostitutes charged much more. A well-regarded courtesan might charge 10 sesterces, 20 sesterces, or even much more for an evening of companionship. The very top courtesans, those who served the wealthiest members of Roman society, might charge the equivalent of many days or even weeks of a laborer's wages for a single night. However, such women were rare and represented a tiny fraction of sex workers. For enslaved prostitutes, the question of earnings is complicated by the fact that they received no direct payment. All money paid by clients went to the slave's owner. The owner would be responsible for housing, feeding, and clothing the enslaved sex worker, but would provide only the minimal necessities required to keep the slave functional. An enslaved prostitute might service dozens of clients per day and generate substantial revenue for the owner while receiving nothing herself beyond basic survival needs. For free prostitutes who worked in brothels, the revenue was typically split between the prostitute and the brothel owner, with the brothel owner taking the larger share. The exact split would vary, but the owner might take half, 2/3, or even more of the earnings. The prostitute would also be charged for her room, for any food provided, for washing facilities, for oil lamps and other necessities, and for anything else the owner chose to charge for. These charges would eat into the prostitute's share of earnings, leaving her with very little. A free brothel prostitute, working full-time, servicing perhaps 10 to 15 clients per day at an average price of 2 to 4 asses per client, might earn 30 to 60 asses per day in gross revenue. However, after the brothel owner's share and after deductions for room and board, the prostitute might keep only 10 to 20 asses per day, if that much. This would be comparable to, or perhaps slightly better than what a female laborer in other occupations might earn, but it was still a poverty-level income that would allow only basic survival. Street prostitutes operating independently would keep more of their earnings since they had no brothel owner to pay, but their prices were even lower and their volume of business might be less reliable. A street prostitute might earn the equivalent of what a free brothel prostitute kept after deductions, but with even less security and more risk. High-class prostitutes who worked independently had much better economic circumstances. A successful courtesan might earn enough to live comfortably, to rent or even purchase a decent home, to employ servants, to buy nice clothing and jewelry, and to accumulate savings. However, such success required not just beauty but also intelligence, social skills, connections with wealthy men, and considerable luck. Most prostitutes never achieved anything close to this level of financial success. The and expenses that prostitutes faced were significant relative to their incomes. Rent for a room or apartment would consume a large portion of earnings. Food was another major expense, and the diet of most prostitutes would be basic and repetitive, consisting mainly of bread, cheap wine, vegetables when available, and occasionally small amounts of cheese or fish. Meat would be rare, clothing and shoes would need to be purchased and would wear out from use, requiring replacement. Cosmetics were necessary for the work, but cost money. Any illness or injury would create additional expenses for treatment or would prevent working and earning. The financial situation meant that most prostitutes lived day to day or week to week with no savings and no cushion against emergencies. If a prostitute became ill and could not work, she would have no income and might quickly fall into debt. If a prostitute became pregnant, the costs of attempting abortion or of being unable to work during pregnancy would be catastrophic financially. If a prostitute was injured or aged to the point where she could no longer attract clients, she would have no means of support and might face destitution. Debt was a constant threat and trap. Prostitutes might borrow money from brothel owners or from other lenders to pay for rent, food, or other necessities when their earnings were insufficient. The interest on these loans would be high, and repaying them would be difficult or impossible. Debt could effectively enslave a free prostitute to a brothel owner, as she would be obligated to continue working to pay off loans that grew faster than she could repay them. This debt bondage was a common situation that kept many prostitutes trapped in sex work even when they wanted to leave. The lack of any social safety net or support system meant that prostitutes faced their economic challenges alone. If they became destitute, there was no government assistance, no charitable institutions specifically for their support, and no family support if they had been disowned or if their families were equally poor. Older prostitutes, who could no longer work, might end up begging or might die in poverty and obscurity. Some prostitutes attempted to save money and plan for the future, setting aside small amounts when possible with the goal of eventually leaving sex work. However, the low earnings, the high expenses, and the unpredictability of income made saving extremely difficult. Most prostitutes remained in sex work until they could no longer physically perform it, at which point they faced grim prospects. The economic realities of prostitution in Rome meant that, while sex work might provide marginally better income than other forms of female labor, it did not provide economic security, social mobility, or any kind of comfortable life for the vast majority of sex workers. The daily activities of prostitutes were driven by constant economic pressure to work as much as possible to earn enough to survive another day. Chapter 6: Social Interactions and Relationships Beyond the actual sex work that consumed most of their time. Roman prostitutes had social interactions and relationships that formed part of their daily experience. Let us examine these social dimensions and understand how prostitutes related to clients, to other sex workers, to brothel owners and pimps, and to the broader society. The relationship between prostitute and client was fundamentally transactional and impersonal in most cases. Clients were paying for a specific service, and once that service was provided, the interaction ended. There was no expectation of conversation beyond what was necessary to negotiate the transaction, no interest in the prostitute as a person, and no concern for her feelings or well-being. The client viewed the prostitute as an object for his use, and the brief nature of the bot encounter reinforced this objectification. However, some clients became regulars who visited the same prostitute repeatedly. These regular clients might develop a preference for a particular prostitute based on her appearance, her services, or simply familiarity. While these repeated transactions were still fundamentally commercial, they might develop a thin veneer of personal connection. A regular client might know the prostitute's name, might engage in brief conversation, might ask how she was doing. The bot prostitute, for her part, might find regular clients preferable to strangers because she knew what to expect from them and because they might treat her marginally better than completely anonymous clients. Some clients might become infatuated with prostitutes and might seek to form deeper relationships. Roman literature includes stories of men who became obsessed with prostitutes, who spent excessive amounts of money on them, who neglected their duties and responsibilities to pursue these relationships. From the prostitute's perspective, such clients could be valuable sources of income if they could be managed properly. But they could also be demanding, possessive, and dangerous if their feelings were not reciprocated or if the prostitute tried to end the arrangement. The relationships between prostitutes who worked together in the same brothel or area could range from supportive to hostile. On one hand, prostitutes faced similar circumstances and could understand each other's experiences in ways that outsiders could not. They might share information about dangerous clients, might warn each other about disease or pregnancy, might provide emotional support, and might help each other in practical ways. These bonds of solidarity could be important sources of support in otherwise isolated and difficult lives. On the other hand, prostitutes were also competitors for clients and income. A beautiful or skilled prostitute who attracted more clients would earn more and might be resented by others. Conflicts over clients, accusations of stealing clients or undercutting prices, and personal disagreements could create hostility. The difficult circumstances and the constant stress could make people irritable and could lead to conflicts that might not arise in less desperate situations. The relationship between prostitutes and brothel owners or pimps was inherently exploitative and characterized by power imbalance. The owner controlled the terms of work, took the larger share of earnings, and had the power to punish, expel, or sell prostitutes if they were enslaved. While some owners might treat prostitutes with basic decency, many were abusive, cruel, and concerned only with maximizing profit. Prostitutes would need to navigate this relationship carefully, being compliant enough to avoid punishment while trying to preserve what little autonomy they had. Male pimps who controlled prostitutes outside of brothels, including street prostitutes, could be even more exploitative and violent. These men would take most or all of a prostitute's earnings in exchange for supposed protection, but would often provide little actual protection while demanding absolute obedience. Violence against prostitutes by their pimps was common and was seen as acceptable, by a society that gave prostitutes little legal protection or social sympathy. The relationships between prostitutes and the broader society were characterized by stigma, marginalization, and contempt. Respectable Romans viewed prostitutes with disgust and considered them to be morally degraded, even while many of these same Romans patronized prostitutes. This hypocrisy created a situation where prostitution was common and accepted as necessary, but individual prostitutes were reviled and excluded from normal social life. Prostitutes faced discrimination and exclusion in many contexts. They could not enter certain temples or participate in certain religious ceremonies. They were supposed to wear distinctive clothing that marked them as prostitutes. They were excluded from the marriage market, as respectable men would not marry known prostitutes, and respectable families would not accept them as daughters-in-law. Their testimony was not accepted in court except in limited circumstances. They were targets of insults and abuse on the street. However, within their own community, prostitutes might form social bonds and might create a subculture with its own norms and values. They might socialize with each other, with tavern workers and other marginalized people, and might develop friendships and support networks that provided some sense of belonging and community. These relationships would be an important part of daily life and would provide emotional sustenance in an otherwise harsh existence. Some prostitutes might maintain relationships with family members, though often their families would be poor and might be unable or unwilling to help them. A prostitute might send money home to support parents or siblings, might maintain contact through visits or messages, or might hope to eventually earn enough to leave sex work and return to family. However, the stigma of prostitution might cause families to disown sex workers, and many prostitutes were completely cut off from family support. Romantic or sexual relationships outside of work were possible but complicated. A prostitute might have a lover or partner who was not a client, someone with whom she had a genuine emotional and physical connection. However, such relationships would be constrained by the prostitute's work, by stigma, and by the jealousy or possessiveness that might arise. A prostitute's partner might be another marginalized person, perhaps another sex worker, a tavern worker, a laborer, or someone else from the lower classes. The possibility of leaving prostitution was something that some sex workers dreamed of and worked toward. A prostitute might hope to save enough money to start a different business, to marry someone who would accept her despite her past, or to otherwise escape sex work. However, the economic realities, the stigma, and the lack of marketable skills made leaving prostitution extremely difficult. Most prostitutes remained in sex work for years or even for their entire adult lives, not by choice but by necessity. Understanding the social dimensions of prostitutes' lives helps us see that their daily experiences were not just about the physical acts of sex work, but also included social interactions, relationships, conflicts, and the constant negotiation of their marginal position in Roman society. These courtois social aspects were part of what they did all day and shaped their experience of sex work. Chapter 7. Conclusion and Daily Life Summary. As we conclude this exhaustive examination of what Roman prostitutes actually did all day, let us summarize and reflect on the patterns and themes that emerge from this detailed exploration. The daily life of a doint Roman prostitute was characterized by repetitive sexual labor, economic survival, social marginalization, and constant vulnerability. A typical day for a brothel prostitute would begin late in the morning with basic hygiene and grooming, preparing for the afternoon and evening work ahead. The core of the day was spent receiving clients in rapid succession, performing sexual services in cramped and unpleasant conditions, and enduring physical discomfort and the risk of violence, disease, and pregnancy. The work would continue into the evening and night, with the prostitute servicing numerous clients before finally being able to sleep, exhausted, in the same cell where she had worked. The economic reality was that prostitutes earned very little, despite working hard and servicing many clients. Most of the revenue went to brothel owners or pimps, and the prostitute was left with barely enough to survive. The lack of savings, the constant threat of debt, and the absence of any social safety net meant that prostitutes lived precarious lives, with no security and limited hope for improvement. The social reality was one of stigma and marginalization. Prostitutes were legally classified as infamous and faced discrimination and exclusion in many contexts. They were viewed with contempt by respectable society even while that society tolerated and patronized prostitution. Within the sex work community, Prostitutes might find some solidarity and support, but they were isolated from mainstream social life. The physical demands and health risks of sex work were significant. Prostitutes faced sexually transmitted infections, gynecological problems from repeated sexual activity, pregnancy and dangerous abortions, and violence from clients. They had limited access to healthcare and had to continue working even when ill or injured because they could not afford to lose income. The psychological toll of sex work was perhaps the most difficult aspect to quantify, but was certainly significant. The dissociation required to endure repeated sexual activity with strangers, the emotional labor of managing clients, the constant vulnerability to violence and abuse, the social stigma, the lack of autonomy, and the absence of hope for a better future, all contributed to psychological distress. Some prostitutes might develop coping mechanisms that allowed them to survive emotionally, but others would suffer from anxiety, depression, and despair. The diversity of experiences within prostitution meant that not all prostitutes had identical daily lives. High-class courtesans had somewhat better conditions, more autonomy, and better pay than brothel prostitutes. Enslaved sex workers had no autonomy at all and were completely at the mercy of their owners. Street prostitutes faced the worst conditions, working in public spaces with no protection. But despite these variations, all point prostitutes were engaged in selling sexual access to their bodies, and all point faced the challenges of sex work in a society that both demanded their services and reviled them as individuals. The Roman system of legal prostitution meant that sex work occurred openly and was integrated into urban life. Brothels were common, were visited by men from all social classes, and were considered a normal part of the city landscape. However, this legality and normalization did not translate into decent working conditions or respectful treatment for prostitutes themselves. They remained marginalized, exploited, and viewed as degraded, despite providing services that society apparently considered necessary. Understanding what Roman prostitutes actually did all day requires recognizing both the mundane and the traumatic aspects of their work. Much of their time was spent in waiting, in basic maintenance activities like washing and dressing, in brief interactions with clients that were repetitive and mechanical, yet this mundane routine was punctuated by moments of vulnerability, risk, and violence that made sex work dangerous as well as degrading. The lack of alternatives available to Roman women helps explain why women entered and remained in prostitution despite its difficulties. Women in the Roman world had limited opportunities for employment, could not pursue most occupations, often lacked family support, and faced poverty if they tried to survive independently. Prostitution, while socially degrading, provided income that might not be available otherwise. For enslaved women, there was no choice at all. Modern perspectives on prostitution, whether viewing it as work that should be decriminalized and normalized, or as exploitation that should be abolished, can both find historical support in the Roman example. The Roman system showed that legal prostitution could exist, could be regulated, and could be integrated into society. It also showed that legal status did not prevent exploitation, abuse, and misery for sex workers, and that social stigma persisted despite legality. As you drift off to sleep, having absorbed this comprehensive and detailed examination of what Roman prostitutes actually did all day, you can rest knowing that you now understand this aspect of ancient Roman social history. The daily lives of Roman sex workers were characterized by hard labor, survival struggles, social marginalization, and human endurance in difficult circumstances. Chapter 8: Legal Status and Registration Requirements. To fully understand the daily experience of Roman prostitutes, we must examine in detail the legal framework that governed sex work and how legal requirements affected prostitutes' daily lives. The Roman legal system regarding prostitution was complex and reflected the contradictory attitudes of accepting prostitution as necessary while stigmatizing individual prostitutes. The registration requirement that prostitutes faced was one of the first formal interactions with the legal system. When a woman decided or was forced to enter prostitution, she would need to go to the Aedil's office to register. This process involved giving her name, acknowledging that she would be working as a prostitute, and receiving official recognition of this status. The registration would be recorded in public records, creating a permanent mark on the woman's legal identity. The act of registration had profound consequences beyond simply allowing the woman to legally sell sexual services. Registration meant accepting the status of infamous, which was a legal category that included not just prostitutes but also actors, gladiators, convicted criminals, and others considered to have forfeited their honor. The infamous designation brought numerous legal disabilities that would affect the woman for the rest of her life, even if she later left prostitution. An infamous woman could not marry into respectable families. Roman law prohibited marriages between citizens of good standing and infamous women, meaning a registered prostitute could never become a legitimate wife to a citizen unless he was willing to sacrifice his own status. This restriction meant that prostitutes were excluded from the normal life trajectory of Roman women, which centered on marriage and family. Even if a prostitute managed to save money and leave sex work, her registered status would continue to prevent her from achieving respectability through marriage. The infamous status also affected property rights and inheritance. While prostitutes could own property and could engage in business transactions, their ability to inherit property through wills was restricted. They could not be named as heirs in the wills of respectable citizens under most circumstances, meaning they could not benefit from the generosity of clients or others who might wish to provide for them after death. This restriction further limited prostitutes' ability to improve their economic circumstances. In legal proceedings, infamous persons, including prostitutes, had limited standing. Their testimony was generally not accepted in court, except in specific circumstances, typically cases involving other infamous persons or cases where no other witnesses were available. This meant that if a prostitute was the victim of a crime, her own testimony about what happened would not be sufficient to convict the perpetrator. She would need other witnesses, and respectable witnesses were unlikely to involve themselves in cases regarding prostitutes. The tax obligations that came with registration meant that prostitutes were required to pay a portion of their earnings to the state. The tax was collected regularly, typically by the edilors or their agents, and failure to pay could result in penalties. For many prostitutes, the tax was just another deduction from their already minimal earnings, further impoverishing them. The state profited from prostitution through these taxes while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that prostitutes were degraded and dishonorable. The registration system also served as a form of social control. By requiring prostitutes to register and by creating public records of who was working in prostitution, the authorities could monitor this population and could enforce regulations. If authorities wanted to crack down on unregistered prostitution, they could compare the women working in brothels against the registration records and could prosecute those who were operating without registration. If authorities wanted to track the movements of prostitutes or wanted to prevent them from entering certain areas, the registration system provided the mechanism for doing so. Once registered, leaving prostitution legally was extremely difficult. A woman who had registered as a prostitute could not simply decide to stop working and reclaim a previous status. The infamous designation was permanent under most circumstances, and the public records of her registration would follow her throughout her life. If she tried to marry respectably or to enter a respectable occupation, her past would be discovered and would disqualify her. The registration system thus created a legal trap that kept women in prostitution, even if they desperately wanted to leave. Some women attempted to work as prostitutes without registering, hoping to avoid the permanent stigma of official recognition. Unregistered prostitution was illegal and could be punished, but enforcement was uneven and many women took the risk. Working without registration meant avoiding taxes and meant preserving the theoretical possibility of later claiming respectability, but it also meant lacking any legal recognition or protection and being vulnerable to prosecution if authorities chose to enforce the registration laws. The daily impact of legal status on prostitutes' lives was thus significant. The knowledge that they were officially designated as degraded, that they had no legal recourse against abuse, that they were taxed on their minimal earnings, and that they could never reclaim respectability created a psychological burden that added to the physical hardships of the work. The legal system reinforced prostitutes' marginalization and exploitation while providing little protection or benefit in return. Chapter 9: Health, Hygiene, and Physical Conditions. The physical conditions in which Roman prostitutes lived and worked had profound effects on their health and well-being. Let us examine in detail the health challenges prostitutes faced and how they attempted to maintain hygiene and cope with illness and injury. The physical environment of lower-class brothels was inherently unhealthy. The small cells where prostitutes worked and slept were poorly ventilated, dark and damp. Fresh air and sunlight which Romans generally recognized as important for health, were minimal. The air would be stale and would smell of bodies, of sexual activity, of oil lamps, and of human waste from chamber pots that might not be emptied frequently enough. This environment was conducive to the spread of respiratory infections, skin conditions, and other illnesses. The lack of adequate washing facilities in cheap brothels meant that prostitutes could not maintain proper hygiene. While wealthier Romans bathed regularly at public baths and valued cleanliness, poor prostitutes had limited access to water for washing and had no access to the baths. They might wipe themselves down with cloths and might use olive oil to clean their skin, as was common Roman practice, but they could not bathe properly. The accumulation of dirt, sweat, and bodily fluids would cause skin problems, body odor, and general discomfort. The repeated sexual activity that prostitutes engaged in created numerous health problems. Vaginal and cervical tissue would become irritated and inflamed from the constant friction and from the lack of adequate lubrication. Romans did not use lubricants in the modern sense, and prostitutes who were not genuinely aroused would experience painful intercourse repeatedly throughout the day. This chronic irritation could lead to tears, abrasions, and infections. Sexually transmitted infections were endemic among prostitutes and their clients. Romans had no understanding of germ theory or of how diseases were transmitted, and they had no effective treatments for most STIs. Gonorrhea, syphilis, and other infections would spread unchecked through prostitute populations and between prostitutes and clients. The symptoms, including genital sores, discharge, pain, and systemic illness, would make work even more difficult and painful, but prostitutes could not afford to stop working when ill. Pregnancy was a constant risk and problem for prostitutes. While various contraceptive methods were attempted, none were reliably effective. Prostitutes would frequently become pregnant despite their best efforts to prevent it. Pregnancy would make them unable to work, or at least unable to work as effectively, causing loss of income at a time when they needed resources. Abortion was the common response to unwanted pregnancy among prostitutes. The methods of abortion available in ancient Rome were dangerous and often ineffective. Herbal preparations made from plants believed to have abortifacient properties would be drunk as teas or decoctions. These preparations included pennyroyal, rue, and other substances that were toxic and that could cause abortion by poisoning the body, but they could also cause serious illness or death to the woman. Physical methods including vigorous exercise, jumping, abdominal massage or blows, and insertion of objects into the uterus were also attempted. These methods were likely to cause injury, infection, and hemorrhage. The death rate from attempted abortions was significant, though exact statistics are impossible to determine. Many prostitutes died from complications of abortion attempts, and many more suffered infections, chronic pain, and permanent damage to their reproductive systems. The desperation that drove prostitutes to attempt these dangerous procedures, despite the risks, shows how incompatible pregnancy was with survival in sex work. Malnutrition was another chronic health problem for most prostitutes. Their diet would be deficient in protein, vitamins, and overall calories, consisting mainly of bread, cheap wine, and occasionally vegetables or small amounts of cheese. This inadequate nutrition would weaken their immune systems, would impair their ability to heal from injuries, would cause dental problems, and would result in chronic fatigue and weakness. Malnourished women would be more susceptible to all forms of illness and would have difficulty recovering from disease or injury. Physical violence from clients was a regular occurrence that created injuries ranging from minor to severe. Prostitutes might be hit, choked, bitten, or otherwise injured during encounters with clients. They might suffer bruising, lacerations, broken bones, or internal injuries. Without access to medical care beyond basic first aid, these injuries would heal slowly if at all, and some would cause permanent disability. A prostitute with visible injuries might have difficulty attracting clients, creating a vicious cycle of injury, reduced income, and inability to access care. Dental problems were common among Romans generally due to their diet and lack of dental care, but prostitutes were particularly affected. The practice of oral sex, which was common in prostitution and which Romans considered degrading, could expose prostitutes to oral infections. Poor nutrition would weaken teeth and gums. Lack of proper oral hygiene would lead to tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss. Dental problems would cause chronic pain and would make eating difficult, further compromising nutrition and health. Parasitic infections, including intestinal, Worms were endemic in Roman society and were particularly common among the poor. Prostitutes would be infected with various parasites from contaminated food and water and from poor hygiene conditions. These parasites would cause digestive problems, abdominal pain, and would further impair nutrition by consuming nutrients that the body needed. Treatment for parasitic infections was limited and often ineffective. Skin conditions, including scabies, lice, and fungal infections, were common in the unsanitary conditions where most prostitutes lived and worked. These conditions would cause itching, discomfort, and visible lesions that might make prostitutes less attractive to clients. The difficulty of maintaining hygiene and the close contact with numerous people would make these conditions difficult to clear even if treatments were attempted. Mental health problems were undoubtedly common, though they were not recognized or treated in modern terms. The chronic stress, the trauma of repeated sexual violence, the lack of control over one's own body, the constant fear, and the absence of hope would cause what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Romans had no concept of these conditions as medical problems and had no treatments. Prostitutes suffering from mental health problems would be seen as melancholic or difficult and would receive no help or sympathy. The cumulative effect of these health problems was that prostitutes aged prematurely and died young. A woman who entered prostitution in her teens or early 20s might look worn and haggard by her late 20s or early 30s. By her mid-30s, she might no longer be able to attract clients and might be forced into the very lowest levels of sex work or might be unable to work at all. Few prostitutes lived to old age, and those who did faced destitution and misery. The attempts to maintain health and cope with illness were limited by poverty and by lack of access to care. Prostitutes might visit healers or physicians if they could afford the fees, but medical care in ancient Rome was limited by poverty and by lack of access to care. Prostitutes might visit healers or physicians if they could afford the fees, but medical care in ancient Rome was of limited effectiveness and was expensive. They might attempt folk remedies including herbal preparations, amulets, and prayers to various gods. They might rely on each other for basic nursing care when ill. Mostly they would simply endure their health problems and hope to survive. Chapter 10. Specific locations and regional variations. While we have discussed Roman prostitution in general terms, it is important to recognize that experiences varied depending on location within the empire and on local conditions. Let us examine specific locations where prostitution occurred and how regional factors affected prostitutes' daily lives. Rome itself, as Boits, the capital and largest city of the empire, had a large and varied sex industry. The city had dedicated prostitution districts, including the area around the Circus Maximus and parts of the Subura, which was a notoriously rough neighborhood. In these districts, brothels of various qualities could be found, from slightly better establishments to the grimmest lupanars. The concentration of brothels in specific areas meant that prostitutes in Rome lived and worked in communities of sex workers, which might provide some sense of solidarity, but which also concentrated all the problems of prostitution in particular neighborhoods. Rome also had numerous taverns, inns, and baths where prostitution occurred alongside other business. The Capanai and Popina, which were taverns and food shops, often employed prostitutes who would serve food and drink to customers and would also be available for sex. The therma or baths had areas where prostitutes would solicit clients, though the more respectable baths attempted to segregate or exclude prostitutes. The streets and public spaces of Rome had street prostitutes working in alleys, under arches, and in cemeteries, which were semi-public spaces used for various activities, including prostitution. Pompeii, preserved by volcanic eruption in 79 CE, provides our best archaeological evidence for Roman prostitution. The famous Lupinare of Pompeii is born, a purpose-built brothel with about 10 cells on 2 floors, with erotic paintings in the cells and in the entrance hallway. The building shows the cramped and basic conditions we have described, with the stone beds and tiny rooms clearly visible. Graffiti on the walls includes names of prostitutes, prices, and crude messages from clients, providing direct evidence of the business conducted there. Pompeii also shows that prostitution occurred in many locations beyond the dedicated brothel. Archaeological evidence suggests that numerous taverns, inns, and other establishments had rooms used for prostitution. The city had street prostitutes, working in various areas. The relatively small size of Pompeii and the detailed preservation of the city allows researchers to map the geography of prostitution and to see how it was integrated into urban life. Ostia, the port city of Rome, had a large sex industry serving sailors, merchants, and travelers passing through. Port cities generally had extensive prostitution industries, catering to mobile populations of men who were away from home and who had money to spend on entertainment. The transient nature of the clientele in port cities meant that prostitutes in these locations dealt with a constantly changing population of clients and had less opportunity to develop regular relationships. The rough character of port areas and the presence of large numbers of sailors and workers made port prostitution particularly dangerous. In frontier regions where Roman military forces were stationed, prostitution served the garrisons of soldiers. Military camps and the civilian settlements that grew up around them, called canabae, had prostitutes serving the soldiers. These prostitutes might travel with armies, might establish themselves in settlements near camps, or might be brought in by entrepreneurs who recognized the business opportunity. Military prostitution was rough and often violent, as soldiers were trained for combat and were accustomed to using force. Provincial cities throughout the empire had their own sex industries scaled to local populations and economies. In wealthy provinces with large cities like Asia Minor or North Africa, prostitution industries similar to those in Rome would exist. In poorer or more rural provinces, prostitution might be less formalized and less visible, but would still exist. Local customs, religious beliefs, and legal traditions would influence how prostitution was practiced and regulated in different regions. In some eastern provinces where temple prostitution had traditional roots, the relationship between religion and sex work created different patterns than in Rome itself. Temple prostitution, where prostitutes were associated with temples and where sexual activity had religious meaning, existed in some areas, though the extent and nature of this practice is debated by historians. Romans generally disapproved of temple prostitution as a foreign custom and attempted to suppress or regulate it in conquered territories. The economic level of different regions affected prostitution. In wealthier areas, prostitutes might charge more and might have somewhat better conditions because clients had more money. In poorer areas, prices would be lower and conditions would be harsher. In regions where slavery was particularly common, enslaved sex workers would be more numerous. In regions with particular demographic patterns, such as areas with large numbers of unmarried men, or with highly skewed sex ratios, demand for prostitution might be especially high. Climate and geography affected daily life for prostitutes. In regions with hot climates, the lack of ventilation in brothel cells would be even more oppressive, and prostitutes would suffer from heat and dehydration. In cold climates, lack of heating would make cramped cells even more unpleasant. In rainy or damp regions, the poor construction and lack of weatherproofing in cheap brothels would make conditions miserable. Street prostitutes would be particularly affected by weather and climate as they worked outdoors in all conditions. Cultural attitudes toward sexuality varied somewhat across the empire despite Roman dominance. In regions with different sexual morality, traditions, prostitution might be viewed somewhat differently than in Rome itself. However, Roman law and culture increasingly dominated throughout the empire, and local variations diminished over time as Roman customs spread and as provincial populations were Romanized. The diversity of locations and conditions means that while we can describe general patterns of prostitutes' daily lives, individual experiences varied. A prostitute in a frontier military settlement would have a different daily experience than one in central Rome, which would differ from one in a provincial Greek city. However, the common elements of sexual labor, economic exploitation, social stigma, and physical hardship would be present in all locations. Chapter 11. Historical Sources and Evidence. Our knowledge of what Roman prostitutes actually did all day comes from various historical sources, each with its own strength and limitations. Understanding these sources and how historians use them helps us appreciate both what we know and what remains uncertain about prostitutes' daily lives. Literary sources provide much of our written evidence about prostitution. Roman authors, including playwrights, poets, satirists, and moralists, mentioned prostitution in their works. The Roman comedies of Plautus and Terence featured prostitute characters and depicted brothels and bond sex work, though these plays were fiction and idealized or exaggerated for entertainment. Poets including Ovid, Catullus, and Martial wrote about prostitutes and about sexual exploits involving sex workers, though again their literary purposes must be considered. Satirists, including Juvenal and Martial, commented on prostitution as part of their broader critiques of Roman society. These authors often used prostitution as an example of moral decay or poor as a vehicle for crude humor. Their accounts are valuable for showing attitudes toward prostitution, but must be read critically since they were making literary and moral points rather than providing objective descriptions. The limitation of literary sources is that they were written by elite men for elite audiences and reflect elite perspectives and prejudices. They tell us what upper-class Roman men thought about prostitution, tell us less about what prostitutes themselves experienced. The voices of prostitutes themselves are almost entirely absent from the literary record, as prostitutes were generally illiterate and were not in positions to produce literature even if they were literate. Legal sources, including law codes, legal commentaries, and court records, provide information about the legal framework governing prostitution. Roman law classified prostitutes, regulated brothels, imposed taxes, and defined the legal disabilities of infamous persons. Legal texts show how Roman society officially dealt with prostitution, though they don't tell us much about daily reality, about how laws were actually enforced in practice. The Digest, compiled in the 6th century but drawing on earlier Roman legal writings, includes numerous provisions related to prostitution and discusses various legal issues involving sex workers. These texts show that prostitution generated legal questions and disputes, and that authorities attempted to regulate and control the industry. However, legal texts reflect prescriptive norms about how things should be rather than describing how things actually were. Graffiti from Pompeii and other sites provides unfiltered evidence from people who were part of the prostitution world. Graffiti on brothel walls includes names of prostitutes, boasts by clients, prices, crude sexual descriptions, and other content that reflects actual practices and attitudes. This graffiti was not created for posterity or for literary purposes, but was spontaneous expression by people involved in prostitution, making it particularly valuable evidence. However, graffiti is fragmentary and often ambiguous. Short phrases scratched on walls don't provide context or tell coherent stories. Interpreting graffiti requires caution and scholarly judgment. Additionally, most graffiti was created by clients rather than by prostitutes, so it still doesn't fully represent prostitutes' own perspectives. Archaeological evidence from preserved sites, particularly evidence from preserved sites, particularly Pompeii and Herculaneum, shows the physical spaces where prostitution occurred. The layout of brothels, the size of cells, the decorations including erotic paintings, the graffiti, and the artifacts found in these spaces all provide evidence for reconstructing the working conditions and daily life of prostitutes. Archaeology shows us things that texts don't mention, like the cramped dimensions of working spaces and the basic nature of furnishings. The limitations of archaeological evidence include the fact that we have good preservation from only a few sites, and these may not be representative of conditions throughout the empire. Additionally, archaeology shows us physical evidence but cannot directly tell us about experiences, emotions, or social relationships. We must interpret the material remains and infer what they meant for the people who lived and worked in these spaces. Comparative evidence from other historical periods and from modern ethnographic studies of prostitution can help fill gaps in our knowledge. While we must be careful about assuming that Roman prostitution worked exactly like prostitution in other contexts, comparative evidence can suggest possibilities and can help us understand aspects of sex work that might be universal or that might be common across different societies. Historians use comparative evidence cautiously, but find it helpful for developing hypotheses and interpretations. The combination of these various sources allows historians to reconstruct plausible accounts of prostitutes' daily lives. Though, with acknowledged uncertainties and gaps, we know more about some aspects of prostitution, like legal status and physical locations, than we know about other aspects like emotional experiences and social relationships. We know more about prostitution in Rome and Pompeii than in remote provinces, where evidence is scarcer. The silences in the historical record are significant. We hear almost nothing from prostitutes themselves about their experiences, feelings, or perspectives. We don't have diaries, letters, or memoirs from prostitutes. We don't have systematic records of prostitution businesses that would tell us about daily operations. We have limited evidence about what happened to prostitutes as they aged or how they attempted to leave sex work. These gaps mean that our reconstructions are necessarily incomplete and speculative in some respects. Modern historical scholarship has increasingly attempted to center the experiences of marginalized people, including prostitutes, and to read sources critically for what they reveal about people whose voices were excluded from elite discourse. Feminist historians and historians of sexuality have developed methodologies for recovering women's experiences from male-authored sources and for reading between the lines of official texts to find evidence of lived reality. This scholarship enriches our understanding of prostitutes' daily lives, even as it acknowledges the limitations of our evidence. Chapter 12, Final Reflections on Daily Life. As we complete this exhaustive examination of what Roman prostitutes actually did all day, let us reflect on what we have learned and consider the broader implications of this history. The daily routines we have described in such detail reveal a social system that was both different from modern societies and that shared some disturbing continuities with ongoing issues around sex, work, and exploitation. Roman prostitutes spent their days engaged in repetitive sexual labor under difficult conditions. They woke late, prepared themselves for work, and spent hours servicing clients in cramped cells or on the streets. They endured physical discomfort, health risks, violence, and social stigma while earning minimal income that barely allowed survival. They had no autonomy, no legal protection, and no hope for better futures. This was their daily reality, day after day, year after year. The social acceptance of prostitution in Rome coexisted with profound contempt for individual prostitutes. Roman society depended on prostitution to provide sexual outlets for men, to preserve the chastity of respectable women, and to generate tax revenue. Yet the women who provided these services were reviled, legally marginalized, and exploited. This hypocrisy created a system where prostitution thrived while prostitutes suffered. The parallels between Roman prostitution and modern sex work are striking in some ways. The economic desperation that drives women into sex work, the violence and exploitation that characterize much of the industry, the stigma that follows sex workers, and the poor health outcomes all echo across centuries. Whether prostitution is legal or illegal, whether it is openly practiced or driven underground, many of the same patterns of vulnerability and abuse recur. However, there are also important differences. Modern sex workers in some contexts have more rights and protections than Roman prostitutes had. The development of labor rights, of recognition of human trafficking and coercion, and of public health approaches to preventing disease among sex workers all represent progress. The feminist movements that have fought for sex workers' rights and for recognition of their humanity have challenged some of the stigma and marginalization that Roman prostitutes faced. The debate about prostitution policy, about whether sex work should be decriminalized as labor or whether prostitution should be abolished as inherently exploitative, can find historical precedent in the Roman example. Rome showed that legal prostitution could be integrated into society and could function as an institution, but it also showed that legal status did not prevent exploitation and suffering. This historical evidence is relevant to modern policy debates while not determining any particular conclusion. Understanding what Roman prostitutes actually did all day requires seeing them as human beings who had daily experiences, who made choices within severely constrained circumstances, who developed coping strategies, who had relationships and emotions, and who struggled to survive in difficult conditions. They were not simply symbols of vice or degradation, but were real people living real lives, and their daily routines deserve to be understood and documented. Chapter 13. Brothel Management and Daily Operations. To complete our understanding of what Roman prostitutes did all day, we must examine the business operations of brothels and how these establishments functioned as commercial enterprises. The daily activities of prostitutes were shaped by the management practices of brothel owners and by the operational rhythms of these businesses. The ownership of brothels varied considerably. Some brothels were owned by independent business people who saw prostitution as a profitable investment. These owners might own a single brothel or might control multiple establishments across a city. Other brothels were owned by wealthy individuals as side businesses or investments alongside other commercial properties. Some owners might be former prostitutes who had managed to accumulate enough capital to purchase their own establishment, though this was rare given the difficulty of saving money from prostitution work. The typical brothel owner, called a leno or lena depending on gender, was a despised figure in Roman culture despite the legal nature of the business. Operating a brothel was legal and could be profitable, but it was socially degrading work associated with exploitation and vice. Brothel owners were classified as infames, along with prostitutes themselves, facing similar legal disabilities. This shared marginal status meant that brothel ownership was typically undertaken by people who already lacked respectability or who were willing to sacrifice social status for economic gain. The daily management of brothels involved multiple tasks beyond simply collecting payments from clients. The owner or a hired manager would need to maintain the physical facility, ensuring it was functional, if not clean or attractive. This meant basic repairs to roofing, walls and doors, the replacement of bedding and other furnishings when they became too worn, and provision of oil lamps and oil for lighting. While brothels were generally maintained at minimal standards, some basic upkeep was necessary to keep the business operational. Security was another management concern. Brothels needed someone to maintain order, to intervene if clients became violent or if disputes arose, and to protect the investment in enslaved prostitutes from theft. Some brothels employed strong men or enforcers who would stand by during busy periods and would be available to eject troublesome clients or to intimidate prostitutes who resisted their conditions. These enforcers were generally rough men from marginal backgrounds who were willing to use violence. The provision of food and water for prostitutes working in the brothel was a daily operational task. The owner would need to arrange for food to be purchased and prepared, though at minimal cost and quality. Bread from a bakery, cheap wine, and occasionally vegetables or other simple foods would be provided. Water would need to be brought from public fountains or wells if the brothel did not have its own water source. These provisions would be charged the prostitutes' accounts, with the owner marking up the costs to extract additional profit. The cleaning of the establishment, to the limited extent that cleaning occurred, might be done by prostitutes themselves, by enslaved workers assigned to this task, or by the lowest status workers in the establishment. The cleaning would focus on removing the most obvious filth and making the entrance and common areas presentable enough to attract clients. The individual cells where prostitutes worked would receive minimal attention, as detailed cleaning was not economically worthwhile. The advertising and marketing of the brothel occurred through various means. The location of the establishment in known prostitution districts was itself a form of advertising, as men seeking prostitutes would know where to go. Signs outside the brothel might indicate what services were available, what the price range was, or other information to attract clients. Some brothels had distinctive paintings or decorations that served as visual advertisements. Word of mouth among clients was important, as men would recommend establishments or specific prostitutes to their friends. The pricing strategy varied by establishment and by individual prostitute. Brothel owners would set base prices for different services, with variations based on the attractiveness and reputation of particular prostitutes. Newer prostitutes, or those considered more attractive, might command slightly higher prices. Older or less attractive prostitutes, or those with visible health problems, might be priced lower to attract clients who could not afford better options. The owner would balance maximizing revenue per transaction against the volume of business, seeking the optimal price point. Special arrangements might be made for regular clients or for clients who paid for exclusive access to particular prostitutes for paid extended periods. A man who wanted to reserve a prostitute for an entire evening or who wanted regular appointments might negotiate a special rate with the owner. These arrangements provided more reliable income for the brothel, but meant that the prostitute involved would be unavailable for other clients during the contracted time. The daily schedule of brothel operations followed a regular pattern. The establishment would open around midday, when men were beginning to have leisure time after their morning activities. Business would build through the afternoon, peak in the early evening, after dinner time, and continue into the night. The brothel would close in the late night or early morning, when client traffic had diminished sufficiently. This schedule was maintained consistently, with the brothel open every day, except perhaps on major religious festivals, when public entertainment might be restricted. The division of revenue between brothel owner and prostitutes followed practices that heavily favored the owner. As discussed earlier, the owner might take half, 2/3, or even more of each transaction's revenue from the prostitute's share. The joint owner would deduct charges for room, joint food, water, lamp oil, and various other expenses. The accounting would be managed entirely by the owner with no transparency or input from the prostitutes, creating opportunities for exploitation and creative bookkeeping that further impoverished the polite sex workers. For enslaved prostitutes, the revenue structure was even more exploitative. All money paid by clients belonged to the slave owner, who had no obligation to provide anything to the enslaved sex worker beyond the minimal necessities required to keep her functional. The owner would calculate profitability based on the revenue generated minus the costs of maintaining the slave, seeking to maximize the return on their investment in human property. The relationship between brothel owner and prostitutes was characterized by control and exploitation, rather than by any form of partnership or mutual benefit. The owner held all power, determined all conditions, collected all financial records, and had the ability to punish or expel prostitutes who were troublesome or who failed to generate adequate revenue. This power imbalance meant that prostitutes' daily lives were shaped by the owner's business decisions and management practices, with no ability to advocate for better conditions or fair treatment. In larger brothels with multiple prostitutes, there might be some hierarchy among the workers. A pint's senior prostitute, or one who was particularly profitable, might be given slightly better accommodations, or might be charged with supervising newer workers. This created divisions among prostitutes, and meant that not all prostitutes had identical daily experiences, even within the same establishment. However, all prostitutes remained subordinate to the owner and remained engaged in fundamentally exploitative labor. The interaction between brothel management and daily life for prostitutes meant that prostitutes were not independent workers controlling their own labor, but were controlled workers whose every prostitute activity was directed by others for others' profit. The daily routines of washing, grooming, waiting for clients, servicing clients, and resting were all structured by the operational needs of the brothel business, rather than by the prostitute's own needs or preferences. Chapter 14. Comparative Context and Historical Significance. Having examined Roman prostitution in such detail, let us conclude by placing this history in broader context and considering what it reveals about ancient society and about the history of sexuality and gender. Prostitution has existed in virtually all complex societies throughout human history, and the Roman example shares certain features with sex work in other times and places while also having distinctive characteristics. The legal acceptance of prostitution in Rome was similar to practices in ancient Greece, in ancient Mesopotamia, and in various other ancient societies, where sex work was integrated into social life. This acceptance contrasts with the prohibition and criminalization that characterized many later Christian and Islamic societies. The use of enslaved people in prostitution was a particular feature of ancient slavery systems, where human beings were considered particular feature of ancient slavery systems, where human beings were considered property and could be used for any purpose, including sexual exploitation. The prevalence of enslaved sex workers in Rome reflected the central role of slavery in the Roman economy and social system. While forced prostitution continues to exist in modern forms, including human trafficking, the explicit enslavement and ownership of sex workers as legally sanctioned property was distinctive to slave societies. The gendering of prostitution, where female prostitutes served male clients, reflected patriarchal social structures where men's sexual desires were prioritized and where women's bodies were treated as resources to be controlled and exploited. Male prostitutes also existed in Rome, serving male clients, and they faced similar stigma and exploitation. However, female prostitution was more common and more visible, reflecting the greater commodification of female sexuality in patriarchal societies. The economic structures that drove women into prostitution in Rome, including poverty, lack of alternative employment, debt, and family breakdown, are similar to factors that continue to push women into sex work in modern contexts. While the specific economic systems differ, the underlying pattern of economically vulnerable women entering prostitution as a survival strategy has remained remarkably consistent across time and place. The health risks faced by Roman prostitutes, including STIs, pregnancy, botched abortions, violence, and general poor health, parallel risks that sex workers continue to face. Modern medicine has reduced some risks through antibiotics, safer abortion procedures, and other treatments, but sex workers in many contexts still face significant health dangers. The lack of healthcare access and the stigma that prevents sex workers from seeking care echo across centuries. The stigmatization of prostitutes despite the social acceptance of prostitution as an institution reveals a hypocritical pattern that has persisted in many societies. People who patronize sex workers or who profit from prostitution maintain social respectability, while the sex workers themselves are degraded and marginalized. This double standard protects clients and exploiters, while harming the most vulnerable participants in the sex trade. The Roman legal framework that attempted to regulate prostitution through registration requirements and taxation reflects ongoing debates about how societies should respond to prostitution. Modern approaches, including legalization with regulation, decriminalization, abolition through criminalizing clients, and full prohibition, all have historical precedents. The Roman example shows that legal regulation can coexist with continued exploitation and poor conditions for sex workers. The near-total absence of prostitutes' own voices from the historical record reflects their social marginalization and their exclusion from literacy and power. This silencing is a form of violence that compounds the physical and economic violence of sex work itself. Modern efforts to center sex workers' voices in debates about prostitution, to listen to their experiences and perspectives, and to support sex worker-led advocacy represent important corrections to historical patterns of silencing. The debate about whether prostitution can ever be truly voluntary or whether it is inherently exploitative can be informed by historical evidence. The Roman example shows women entering prostitution through slavery, debt, poverty, and lack of alternatives, with little evidence of truly free choice. However, some Roman prostitutes, particularly high-class courtesans, apparently had some degree of agency and success within the constraints of their situation. This complexity resists simple conclusions. The integration of prostitution into Roman urban life, with brothels as normal features of the urban landscape, and with prostitution accepted as necessary social infrastructure, contrasts with later approaches that relegated prostitution to hidden or marginal spaces. The visibility of Roman prostitution meant that prostitutes were part of daily urban experience rather than being completely hidden from public view, though this visibility did not translate into respect or decent treatment. The Roman example demonstrates that prostitution exists within broader systems of gender inequality, economic exploitation, and social hierarchy. Prostitution was not an isolated phenomenon, but was connected to slavery systems, to patriarchal gender relations, to urban poverty, to male social privileges, and to cultural attitudes about sexuality and honor. Understanding prostitution requires understanding these broader contexts and systems. The daily lives of Roman prostitutes that we have examined in such detail over the course of this lengthy exploration were shaped by all these factors: their mornings spent preparing for work, their afternoons and evenings servicing clients, their struggles with health and hygiene, their navigation of legal and social systems, and their constant economic pressures all occurred within specific historical contexts, while also revealing patterns that transcend particular times and places. The historical significance of studying Roman prostitution lies partly in understanding Roman society itself, how it functioned, what values it held, and how it organized sexuality and gender. It also lies in recognizing longer historical patterns in how societies have organized sex work, exploited vulnerable people, and justified systems of oppression. History does not provide simple lessons or prescriptive solutions, but it does provide context and evidence that can inform contemporary understanding. As you finally drift off to sleep after this exhaustive, lengthy, and admittedly rather depressing exploration of what Roman prostitutes actually did all day, you can rest knowing that you have gained comprehensive historical knowledge of a difficult subject. The daily routines we have examined in such minute detail, from waking and washing through hours of client service to eventual exhausted sleep, reveal both the specific conditions of Roman sex work and broader patterns of exploitation that remain relevant. The lives of Roman prostitutes, while lived 2,000 years ago in circumstances very different from our own, speak to enduring questions about autonomy, dignity, survival, and resistance. Sleep well, and may your dreams take you far from the cramped cells and difficult lives that we have explored tonight. Good night, and may you wake tomorrow with appreciation for the freedoms and securities that distance us from the harsh realities of Roman prostitution.